One thing I didn't talk about in the Apolitical World Map update, although I did talk about it in the Middle East arms purchases video from a few months ago, is the 2020 Israel peace deal. At the time of that aforementioned video, Israel had signed a treaty of recognition with the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain, and it was clear that the deal intended to have a larger scope. America aimed to bring the Arab world in line with Israel against Iran, therefore ultimately linking Israeli and Saudi Arabian policy. It appeared that these two deals were the first couple of steps towards bringing Saudi Arabia's Arab allies in line with the plan before attempting to bridge the final gap between Jerusalem and Riyadh. Since then, the deal has expanded in scope, although it doesn't yet include Saudi Arabia. But with the Trump administration apparently ending and recent semi-secret talks having occurred, it would appear that Saudi Arabia's joining could be in the near future. So I wanted to take a look at the background of the 2020 peace deals, their impact on local and regional politics for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and some of the other regional players, and of course how it fits into the greater global geopolitical game. Back in 1967, Israel took control of the Arab-majority West Bank of the Jordan River from the controlling Jordanian forces. They won other victories in this war, but the West Bank and the subsequent settlements Israel established in the area are, of course, the heart of the matter when it comes to these peace deals. Israel, of course, began colonizing the territory, which it of course views as its own, and the only thing that prevented Israel from annexing the territory was international pressure. The international community supported and in some cases recognized the Palestinian Arabs, and because of this, Israel did not find support even from America or Britain on annexation of the West Bank, nor did it want to take on the types of demands that would be asked of it by the international community should it annex the territory, such as granting Israeli citizenship to the local Arab inhabitants. Israeli settlements of the region were at first unofficial, later officially backed. Later they were under the table officially backed and eventually openly backed by the Israeli government, at least some parties in it. Early unofficial Israeli settlements in the military occupation zone had meager support in Israel's government. However, as time went on, these gained a measure of support. There is so much history here to go over, and I do want to get to today's impact, so we'll skip ahead the Oslo Accords. Now by this time, a civil administration was in place, still under the jurisdiction of the Israeli Defense Forces. Settlers and Palestinian Arabs alike were administered by this entity, though in practice the settlers were essentially held to domestic Israeli law. However, as part of the Oslo Accords, the Arabs gained the right to self-government in certain parts of the territory, although still under the jurisdiction of the Israeli civil administration. Now, the civil administration itself would apply direct rule to most of the rest of the territory. However, in practice, Israel administers Palestinian areas of the places under its direct rule, essentially as it ruled all Palestinian areas prior to the Oslo Accords, and at least on paper, according to the same law that the Palestinian Autonomous Administration follows in the areas where it operates. Plus, in practice, Israel's military operates in the Palestinian Authority areas anyway. Thus, the Palestinian Authority areas, what Oslo calls A and B, along with the Palestinian areas of Area C, according to Oslo, which is the areas of Israeli direct rule, are effectively under the same military/Jordanian law applied by the Israeli civil administration of the West Bank, whether that be through direct Israeli rule or through the Palestinian Authority. Meanwhile, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which comprise the parts of the areas directly administered by Israel that are not majority Palestinian, did not have the law of the civil administration placed upon them, but instead had Israeli domestic law installed under the table, even though Israeli leadership has never approved this, with the settlements effectively being made a separate entity, the Judea and Samaria area, a name which, upon capture of the West Bank, had been proposed for the entire occupied zone until it wasn't annexed. These settlements under the Judea and Samaria area administration are also not annexed to Israel because, again, Israel's leadership hasn't approved Israeli law to be put in place there, even though it has. But the idea of an official annexation lies at the heart of the current series of peace deals, the story of which really begins with the Trump administration's Israel policy and America's attempts in the late 2010s to broker a semi-stable balance of power in the Middle East so that it could focus its attention on communist China. The Trump administration began its pivot of Israel policy on March 25, 2019, with a proclamation that recognized the Golan Heights, which Israel obtained in 1967 and annexed in 1981, as Israeli territory. And although America didn't encourage other countries to join them in this endeavor, it was a preemptive step towards what would be in the final deal that was going to be proposed to settle the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This deal was finally announced on January 28th of 2020. Now, unlike the recognition of the Golan Heights, which is a direct action by the American government, this was a policy proposal sanctioning Israel to take actions with the presumption that America would then go on to recognize them. The Peace to Prosperity Plan, also known as the Deal of the Century, proposed for Israel to annex all of the Judea and Samaria area, the Israeli settlements and military areas, while allowing an autonomous and possibly even independent Palestinian entity to eventually be established in the other areas, that's areas A and B, and the Palestinian areas of Area C, everything under the current civil administration, along with Gaza if it was ever taken back from Hamas control, and a couple of other enclaves near Gaza, which would be connected across the rest of Israel's territory by a freeway tunnel. The question about the future sovereignty of a would-be Palestine involves the fact that this is effectively numerous disjointed entities connected by narrow land and/or tunnel connections, and in many cases having to cross what are currently Israeli checkpoints when having to cross the settlement areas. In the hypothetical deal, Israel would refrain from building settlements in the would-be Palestinian areas, but only for 4 years. And obviously a resumption of settlements would not be something that would seem to coincide with Palestinian sovereignty. However, in the end, under this plan, the status is essentially up to Israel. Both this non-guaranteed status of the Palestinians and the Israeli ability to annex much of the West Bank made this plan difficult or impossible to accept for Israel's Arab neighbors, which in the past, of course, have been at war with Israel and who ever since have supported the Palestinian cause for statehood. None of these countries, aside from Egypt and Jordan, even recognized Israel as a state. But Israel and the Trump administration would use this deal, which was unacceptable to the Arab states, as a leverage point to barter with these Arab countries for a recognition deal. The Arab states feel threatened by Iranian influence, which in the last decade has extended across the Middle East, and both American allied factions, the Arab states and Israel, realized that it was in their geopolitical best interests to make a deal, even if it was unpopular at home, where support from the Palestinians is still widespread in most of these countries. How Israel was going to use the Trump proposal as a bartering position became clear when it signed the first deal for recognition with the United Arab Emirates on August 13, 2020. The deal was essentially that the United Arab Emirates would recognize Israel, although it would not recognize the Golan Heights, and in return, Israel would suspend its planned annexation of the West Bank until further notice. Thus, Israel really didn't have to give up anything that it has now to make the deal, and rather just leveraged the American peace proposal, with certainly the assistance of the American State Department, into the deal for mutual recognition with the United Arab Emirates. The two countries also plan to forge more economic ties, including transportation and cargo links. In September, it was announced that the Kingdom of Bahrain had signed a similar deal. Now, unlike the UAE and Bahrain, Sudan has actually sent troops to fight against Israel in the past wars, but following the ouster of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the Provisional Sudanese administration was more open to Israeli ties, something that even Bashir's administration had been considering as Sudan was growing desperate for economic ties and normalization in the final years of his rule. On October 23rd, the provisional regime in the Sudan officially normalized ties with Israel. Whether this extends to full recognition will have to be seen, but the deal is in the same vein as the previous two, with the Israel recognition and normalization deals being collectively referred to as the Abraham Accords. Because the Provisional Sudanese government, which is ruling by decree, replaced the longtime autocrat Bashir, they have committed to legislative elections and say that the deal is contingent on approval by a future Sudanese legislative assembly. This deal is less of a sure thing than the other two, but at the same time Israel also has less to lose, with many regional projects being planned in the Arabian Peninsula, contingent on all the area countries joining the accords. Now, the linchpin of the Arabian Peninsula portion of these deals are the two Arab monarchies that either funded wars against Israel or fought against them directly, that being the Saudis and the Hashimis, with Amman and Riyadh representing both the biggest and the most pivotal prizes for establishing alliances and trade ties across the Arabian Peninsula. Most of Israel's planned projects with the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain would be dead without the cooperation of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. As such, the strategy has been to essentially work around this and get other countries on the periphery of the region to join first, this being a reason why a country like Sudan was included. The idea seems to be to put pressure on Amman and Riyadh once all their neighboring countries have signed the deal. It's been speculated that the Sultanate of Oman could be the next country on the Arabian Peninsula to join the deal, but recently it's been countries around the further periphery that have been signing, with the Sudan and Bahrain agreements being preceded by a Kosovo agreement on September 4th. Kosovo, of course, is a European country with an Albanian Muslim majority from Ottoman times, which broke away from Serbia with UN help in 2008, following American assistance that it received in the late 90s war against Serbia, the then Yugoslavia. However, 10 to 20 years on, Kosovo and Serbia were negotiating for their own economic normalization, although Serbia does still refuse to recognize Kosovo and claims it as its territory, though any Serb politician who didn't would likely lose their popularity at home. As part of the American mediation for the Kosovo-Serbia negotiations, Israel was looped into the deal, having been made a part of the overall framework. Serbia had already recognized Israel at this point. However, the Serbs took an additional step by moving their embassy to Jerusalem, following the steps of America back in 2018. Most international embassies in Israel are in Tel Aviv, as Jerusalem is divided between the Israeli-occupied zone of the West Bank and Israel proper. However, Israel has annexed parts of the city, and thus many other countries just decided to stay away from the area completely. Although Kosovo did not go so far to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, tying Israel into the Kosovo-Serbia deal gave the two countries a common point to agree on, and therefore enabled their economic cooperation with not only Israel and America, but each other. This wasn't the only common point thrown in that deal. For example, America also insisted that both countries agree to ban the Chinese telecom giant Huawei from their telecommunications networks, one of the primary American foreign policy goals in 2020, along with the Israel deals, and in this case it's just another common point for Serbia and Kosovo to connect over as they move forward with more normalized economic ties. Several other common points were thrown into the Serbia-Kosovo agreement as well. Thus, Israel has become essentially the leader of a pro-American, anti-Iran, anti-China bloc in which Europe, Levantine, and Arabian partners are all connected, with again the future hope that Oman, along with most importantly Saudi Arabia and Jordan, will sign the accords. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan has already recognized Israel, but the former occupier of the West Bank formally joining this agreement would be a major step. However, before any of this potentially happens with Saudi Arabia, Oman, or Jordan, another angle has been added to the equation, as one of the westernmost Arabic countries, Morocco, signed a normalization agreement with Israel on December 10th. Morocco agreed to recognize the State of Israel, although not its sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and once again, part of the agreement being that Israel is suspending its annexation of the West Bank. However, it also appears possible that a precedent is being set where the temporary suspension of the annexation could resume, and America could encourage wider recognition of the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, based on the carrot that America threw into the Israel-Morocco deal, which is that America, but not Israel, will now recognize Morocco Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, most of which Morocco has annexed as its southern provinces. America now in fact recognizes the entire claimed territory of the Western Sahara, including the Rump Sahrawi state, which actually just declared war on Morocco, with only one battle having been fought so far, and a war that looks like it's fizzled out. We did cover that in our most recent video, so check that out. But in this deal, America recognized both the Moroccan occupied territories and the current Sahrawi state as Moroccan territory, saying that it no longer believes an independent Sahrawi state is viable. This is somewhat in parallel to its approved annexation of the West Bank by Israel in recognition of the Golan Heights. Thus, it's possible in the future Israel recognizes Morocco's claims over Western Sahara, potentially in return for, say, Morocco recognizing the Golan Heights. To take it a step further, it could even set a precedent beyond that for Morocco and Israel to mutually approve of each other's annexations, Israel with its hypothetical annexation in the West Bank, and Morocco with its hypothetical conquest of the remainder of Western Sahara. However, the last part of this is just speculative, and it's possible that America simply included the Western Sahara recognition as a carrot for Morocco to join the agreement and to buy a large supply of American drones. What it means as far as future annexations and recognitions and that kind of thing, again, that's just speculative. The one thing in the immediate future that remains to be seen is what Oman, Jordan, and most importantly Saudi Arabia will do, and if they join the accords to form a fully Arab-Israeli bloc against Iran, something that 40 years ago, before the fall of the Iranian monarchy, when Arab-Israeli wars were raging, would have seemed impossible. But now the regional geopolitics have shifted, and we'll wait and see over the next few months whether any of these moves happen. If they do, we'll keep on top of it right here on Wayback History.
If you want more on current geopolitics, be sure to check out the most recent update to the Apolitical World Map. A video summarizing the changes is about to appear on your screen, so check that out, or check out the rest of our content on historical geopolitics. I've got a Patreon set up as well, so go help out the channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Alex. I'm out.